So we're at time here. A few more people trickling in, but I just want to thank everybody for joining us here today. We're going to go over a little bit about Microsoft Entra, which was announced at Ignite 2022. Hopefully some of you paid attention to some of those announcements there. There's a lot around identity and security. There's a lot to cover, but I'm giving just a little bit more time for people to trickle in. All right. Also, this presentation will be recorded, obviously, and put up to YouTube after it's done on our Now Micro YouTube channel. If you are not already subscribed, go ahead and do that. We have quite a bit of content around not only our services, what Now Micro does, but also some great content on our purpose-built computer side of things, and some great content on there from our CTO, Bernard Carter. If you've joined any of those in the past, there's some very interesting stuff there. So, all right, next slide. So what is Microsoft Entra? Actually, this slide needs to come before. Let's do this first. Okay, who am I? I'm Tim Davis. If hopefully some of you in the audience aren't complete strangers to me, you've had a chance to work with me or see me present or talked, or maybe we've been on phone calls together. But essentially, I am Now Micro's, I'm an enterprise system consultant with Now Micro. I am the subject matter expert here for almost all things productivity, and with an emphasis on identity security and identity management, Azure Active Directory. I'm MCSA certified security administration, certified in Office 365, and I've also have my MCSE in productivity, which would be Exchange 2016, Exchange 2019, Exchange Online, Teams, all that happy stuff. I also serve on the board, the Minnesota M365 user group board. I'll have a little bit more on that in a later slide. There's some cool events coming up both with Now Micro and with the user group that you guys should be aware of. I'm hoping you guys have joined or are aware of that organization. So who are we at Now Micro? This is a big thing as well. We're kind of a multi-headed beast here at Now Micro. We do a lot of things that can really help you and supplement you as an organization, allow you to get off your feet running, both on the software and hardware side of things. Obviously, we handle the device lifecycle, so we can help you procure, deploy, manage, and retire all of your devices. On the professional services side, we're heavy into the Microsoft, the M365 stack, modern management, SCCM, endpoint manager, Intune, and config manager and identity. We also offer managed services as well, which is our service desk offering, NOC, SIEM, and SOC, as well as security awareness training. And then we also develop and will build purpose-built hardware and software solutions to help you manage your infrastructure, as well as if you need hardware for, say, signage or something in particular. That's something we can help you out with as well. Now Micro, and like I mentioned before, there's some upcoming events. For example, Tech Connect in December 13th. I believe this is John Anderson. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm sure some of you are familiar with him as well. He will be giving a Tech Connect on Microsoft Intune, SCCM, and Autopilot best practices. In my opinion, he's one of the best guys in the state when it comes to this, so it's something that I will tune into for sure. If you want to find out about Now Micro's events, nowmicro.com/events. We'll list everything out there. Usually we have a month or two of the Tech Connects listed on there, as well as any other events. If there's vendor events, our open house that we had earlier this summer was listed on there. There's a whole bunch that you might find there. So if you get a chance, check that out. You can register through the website for our mailing list so you can be informed when something comes up. So as I mentioned before, I serve on the board of the Minnesota M365 user group. Coming this Friday, you still have time to register, don't worry. But we have an all-day event called the M365 Workshop Day. This is, I think, somewhere around our, it's got to be almost approaching 10 of them that we've done. It used to be an annual event that we did in person when it first started off at the MTC in Edina. Obviously, things happened in the world that prevented us from doing that in-person event. So we've quickly shifted that to a remote workshop event. Keep you updated on possibly an in-person component to both our user group meetings and the future workshop days. But for now, we have 5 sessions or 5 tracks, each with 4 sessions that cover the gamut between automation, administration, uh, adoption, security, and I believe, I'm not 100% sure, but if you go and check out mn365.org/events, you can actually click into the admin workshop day. It'll list all of the tracks, who's presenting that day, and allow you to register for that event. So hopefully some of you here will see on Friday. It's an all-day event, but you don't, obviously, since it's remote and virtual, you don't have to sit through the entire track. You can hop in and out of the tracks you'd like. We also have prizes, giveaways, all that happy stuff. So hopefully we'll see you there. All right. So let's go back to my slide that's way out of order. So what is Microsoft Entra? Similar to what we saw previously with the enterprise mobility and security, Microsoft Entra at its heart is essentially another security bundle, identity and security bundle for Microsoft or M365 and Azure AD services. Is it more marketing than it is anything else? I mean, you could say, yes, the Entra branding is marketing, but I think there's some very specific components that are announced along with Entra and are being bundled under Entra that warrant us to take a closer look. Some things that I'm very excited about. Some things that will help everything from the small business organizations up to, the larger, 1,000-seat plus organizations and even higher really manage their identity, their security, who has permissions to what, and life cycle and whatnot. So we'll go through everything that was announced in Microsoft Entra. What is this all in response to? And this is an old slide. I'm sure some of you have seen this before, or seen something similar. But why are we looking at identity issues? Why are we looking at some of this stuff? It's because of the old world, the network-centric security model, versus the new world that we're looking at, where our identities and we no longer have that network perimeter that we can use to protect things. More of our data is living in the cloud. More of our endpoints are remote. We can't necessarily rely on that VPN. We can't necessarily shut down all of our authentication endpoints. We're using the identity now as that perimeter. So who you are and what you have. So this is, man, I really should have ordered these better. But Entra, it was announced at Ignite 22. It's Identity and Access Services. It's really the overarching name for identity access management, cloud infrastructure, and entitlement management, which would be similar to your privileged identity management, and then identity verification. And it goes much deeper than this. Hopefully, in the next couple slides, you'll get an idea of, it's not just Azure AD rebundled. It's a movement towards something a little bit different. It's and something to help you not only manage your Microsoft, but your multi-cloud environments and your identities as a whole. All right. So what are our challenges surrounding identities? Why would Microsoft go out and release and package and market a product like this? More and more, as that network-centric model of security disappears, we need to be able to identify on the user front, verify that credentials being used belong to the person that's using it. They aren't acquired via phishing. If I'm sure all of you are very, very aware of the uptick in phishing and bad actors using social engineering to basically give people access to credentials or strip people of their credentials. Man in the middle attacks are a good example. We need to protect, and then we also need to protect our accounts with privilege access, our admin accounts. There's many more challenges on the user side, but this is just kind of the 10,000 level. What are we concerned about? We need to be able to protect our apps, right? We need to be able to protect the both cloud on-premise apps. We need to be able to verify the identities with the even despite their ability to answer MFA prompts without passing credentials. We'll get into this a little bit when we're talking about applications in our organization that may be disparate and not necessarily uh, it's essentially talking about machine accounts or workload identities, which we'll get into in a little bit. Devices, we need to be able to decide whether a device should be trusted on port of entry and make that decision whether a device that is trusted is important for access to a certain resource. And then business to business, more and more the demand for collaboration between business is at the forethought of every partnership. How do we verify that the people that have access to the data in our tenant are who they say they are, even though they may have a different idea of security than we do? They may be more relaxed or more stringent. How do we make sure that we're managing those business to business connections, that we're expiring the connections or expiring the permissions that we're giving to people outside of our tenant and really even our own tenant when they're not needed? And how are we monitoring and analyzing the permissions that are given our tenant and the access to certain data? So even past just privileged access, just access to the data in our organization. How are we managing it for our organization, and how are we managing it for our partners? So Microsoft Entra, when they made the announcement, encompasses more than some existing features and some features that are new to us, that are things that we haven't necessarily talked about or seen before. Azure Active Directory being the biggest one. I'm sure most of the people in this meeting, if the slide or if you were gone through the time to register through this session, I'm fairly certain you're pretty familiar with what Azure Active Directory is. We will go over what's included in that and just a precursory look. Entra permissions management was a new announcement. Entra verified ID, Entra identity governance, and Entra workload identities. And we're by no means going to break apart every single one of these and take a look. There is a lot to unpack here, and we really only have an hour. So my hope here is that I can demystify the marketing behind Entra, show you the service offerings behind it, and let you make the decision on, okay, this seems to make sense for our organization. I want to do more digging. You can reach out to me. I can give you more resources. We're always open for discovery calls on any of this as well. And then a lot of this is still in preview and being developed on. So a lot of this is also in response, for example, Entra Verified ID to a growing movement may not be something that you need to put in place today, but maybe something that almost every organization down the line has to have an answer to. And we'll get into that shortly here as well. All right, so Azure Active Directory, our old friend, right? I've presented on Azure Active Directory and identity security many times. As well as this is at the heart of most of our engagements, at least my engagements with our clients. What can we do with Azure Active Directory? Obviously, some of the big from an identity security standpoint, some of the big things are multi-factor authentication, device trust with in tune with, I was going to say in tune with Intune, you can do device trust, but along with Intune, you can do device trust with conditional access, geo blocking, blocking legacy authentication, essentially just developing a scope and the requirements for access to certain services in M365 and any other of your applications, SaaS apps or on-premise apps that you may require uh, additional verification or may have a security requirement around. So that's our conditional access bundle. Azure Identity Protection or Defender for Identity and Defender for Identity goes into deeper analytics of users and their behavior and their sign-in risk behaviors. Are we getting alerting on when a user has impossible travel events? If users have risky sign-ons, identifying those users that may be getting password sprays. I've like I said, I've presented on this before. Anybody has any questions and wants to go deeper on any of those features, let me know. Azure Rights Management and Azure Information Protection. Templating and protecting documents or our data at the document level, ensuring that permissions are set via templates, actions based on those template sets, like encryption, preventing sharing externally, preventing printing, preventing screenshots. So really managing that data at the document level and making sure that the appropriate protections are on our data at the document level. And enterprise app registration. So I think I put signal sign-on for single sign-on. That's awesome. Good. That's good QA on my slides here. So, but single sign-on and security controls for on-premise and SaaS apps, enterprise app registration, also developing accounts. Traditionally, if we had, let's say we had an on-premise app that wanted to reach out to some data in the cloud, we might create that app an account. We might then give the app on premise the account's credentials and allow it to sign in to access. So authenticate exactly like a user would. The more modern iteration of that, since we've gone to modern authentication, we no longer allow some of those legacy authentication schemes to happen. We are registering apps in Azure Active Directory and using more of a certificate-based authentication or a client secret authentication. So we can bypass that authentication scheme that we have for the users, and we don't have to be beholden to our modern authentication, our MFA, and our conditional access. And then on top of that, we can control exactly what permissions within our organization that those apps have, as opposed to giving them an account that may have quite a bit more, an account that could be compromised and may have quite a bit more access than it really needs. Well, here we get into the meat of what's new. So Entra permissions management. So what is Entra permissions management? It is really a cloud infrastructure and entitle management service. It is a multi-cloud solution. So it basically comes from a purchase that Microsoft made of a SIEM provider that is now wrapped into Entra permissions management. I've been playing with this a little bit since it came up. It is in preview. I'll go through licensing and a general availability and previews in a slide when I'm kind of finished explaining all the services. So don't worry about that. But essentially, if you're using more and more organizations are spread across the multi-cloud, right? We have AWS, we might have Google Cloud Platform, Azure, we have resources there. What Entra really allows us to do is discover and make sure that we are paying attention to what entitled accounts and privileged accounts are in all of our cloud, right? Not just Azure's. It's easy to, I shouldn't say easy. It's easier from within Azure to go out and say, okay, here are all our privileged accounts and audit that. But what it is a single pane of glass across your multi-cloud that allows you to discover, remediate, and monitor those privileged accounts and entitlement grants. And we'll go. So cross-cloud permissions discovery, creep index, so evaluate unused and excessive permissions. So going across all of your multi-cloud and making sure that the model of least appropriate permissions is giving, and we're not giving more than we need. Also, we can tell with usage analytics. We also have the ability to automate removal of unused permissions and permissions on demand, similar to what we can build in Azure Privileged Identity Management. We also have the ability to monitor, so machine learning empowered anomaly detections, like you would see in the Microsoft security graph that is leveraged to use that is leveraged in identity protection in that Microsoft Defender suite. And then obviously reporting and auditing on your multi-cloud identities and their actions. So what are these identities doing? And then alerting when something becomes out of something that may be happening that's out of context or something that you might not be expecting. We see a lot of this if you are using Azure AD and identity protection, where we get alerts regarding, forwarding rules or unusual amount of deletions. Imagine that kind of alerting across the cloud, your multi-cloud, so across your AWS and Google as well as Azure. And hopefully we can go over that a little bit more. I can show you kind of what that looks like if we don't run out of time. I have some demos. I don't have a great demo environment for it, but I can at least show you what the panes of glass look like and what the lift is to spin up Entra permissions management. Next is Entra verified ID. So verified ID, when I first heard of this, I actually have heard of decentralized identity long before I heard of Entra verified ID. But it is Microsoft's solution for a growing movement towards decentralized identities. Hopefully some of you are kind of familiar with this principle, but it may be, at least when I first heard it was abstract. It took a little bit of unpacking before I could really process what they're talking about. But as you're aware, we have, as a user, we have many identities, right? When I sign into my Facebook account, that identity lives in Facebook's databases. If Google, Microsoft, I don't even want to think about how many identities that I have across all the Microsoft platforms. But at the end of the day, those identities don't belong to me. They represent me, but they live in the disparate services. So they aren't tied together. However, they may share credentials, right? I may sign into a service that I assume is secure, give it the same username and password as I do my bank account. But let's say it's for a form that talks about, well, for example, I'm a big pinball junkie, so PinSide is something that I authenticate against all the time. Many people might say, well, I don't want to manage 83 different passwords, and there has been some advancements in password management, but at the end of the day, you're going to have some overlap between credentials and passwords. And let's say some of those lower security authentication methods get hacked or they leak. The first thing people do when they buy those hacked credentials is they go out and they test them against, your bank account, or they test them against your social media. They test them against your work or school accounts through Microsoft. So what centralized identity essentially is doing is it's preventing all of those desperate accounts that live in all of these different places and all of these different apps, and bringing it back to you as the user. I have a kind of a slide that might help explain this a little bit better. Unfortunately, since this is a live event, I don't get a whole lot of feedback, so I'm hoping you guys are tracking along with me. And if you do have questions, oh, it does look like we have a question. So, oh, okay. So that's just, never mind. That's just Caitlin asking. So if you do have questions, let me know. I can see the Q&A here, so throw them in there. If you're not following along or you want something clarified, I will do that to the best of my ability. But some of the stuff I'm still learning on as well. But centralized versus decentralized identity. So you can see where the cost, or the plus and minuses are for centralized identity versus decentralized identity. So where does the data live? In a centralized identity, it's in a centralized database. So it's Google's database, it's Microsoft's database. Where with a decentralized identity, it's on the user's devices. And here's where we're going to get into, how does this look in the future? Essentially, it's going to be on some type of device provider or some type of standardization, and we're still kind of looking for that. There are some things that are going on in development that are looking promising, but we really need probably a large hardware manufacturer like Apple or Samsung, or both or all, to decide on a a standard for this, but essentially, in theory, it would live on your device. So you would own your identity. The identity, as opposed to centralized, the data would be held by the organization with whom the data is shared. So Google, Facebook, what have you. With a decentralized identity, you own that data. Um, what data is disclosed. So when I create my account, in Facebook, basically I'm disclosing all of my data to Facebook, since they essentially own not only the data that I give them, but anything I produce, all the things I upload, it's all there. With decentralized identity, it gives us more granular control on consents to what data is disclosed. So we can pick and choose. We own the data. We can pick and choose what those services actually see and what we actually give them. And here's the biggest one. So how many identities are needed for a centralized identity? It's one for each. It's so many. I mean, I'd like to get some numbers. I meant to look up some numbers on how many on average a normal human being has, by the time they hit 40. In this day and age, it's got to be astronomical. I guarantee you that each one of us in here has identities that we don't even remember creating in databases. If you've ever gone to create account within a website and you input your email address and it says, "Oh, you already have an account." That happens to me quite frequently. I'm sure it does for you as well. With a decentralized identity, we have a single identity with multiple verified credentials. So to explain kind of how this works, and I think I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, but hopefully you guys can see this here. It's a little bit small, but essentially the user's identity, if you see the top graphic here, Alice is the user with her identity. So that identity lives in what looks like basically an Apple Wallet card. She is going to Prosware software, and she's asking for a student discount. So the student discount basically, or the Prosware software is asking, okay, how do I verify that you have this? It asks the question of the identity. Alice's identity then reaches out to Woodgrove, where she was an employee or was in school. Woodgrove then attests to the fact that she is in fact a student or an employee, which is then passed back to the identity, then presented to Prosware, where she'd be able to purchase the software. So it's all about essentially requesters and attestations of credentials. So the actual identity lives in the central, but the issuer, the requesters and the attesters to specific credentials. So that is generally what we're going to have to address for in the future is, how do I request what the information I need about a particular user, and how do I attest to credentials that live within my organization, whether that be, yes, you are a customer, yes, you do qualify for this use benefit, you do qualify for this particular, or you've achieved this certification or this status. It's an attestation to what's being asked of the issuer. Hopefully that makes sense. It's a little goofy, but you can see in the bottom where Microsoft Authenticator is used. Microsoft Authenticator then becomes your centralized identity, and Woodgrove is asking for something in particular. Microsoft Authenticator is brokering the request with Prosware and back and forth. Right. So moving on to Entra identity governance. I think I'm good. Yeah, I think we scheduled about an hour for this. So I'm trying to leave a little bit of room on the back end so I can show you some of this as well, and maybe give a little time for questions. But so Entra identity governance was also announced as one of the big pieces with Entra, Microsoft Entra, and that includes some very exciting things as well. Some things that people have been asking for a long time. In my opinion, the biggest one being the lifecycle workflows. So if you've everybody has a lifecycle workflow for their organization, right? They have the ability, or they have some type of, whether it be a technical workflow or just a process workflow for creating user. Still hear me, right, Caitlin?
Yep, we still hear you.
Okay, my headset just shut off. That's super cool. It is plugged in for that exact reason, but so our life cycle workflows being that our when we have somebody on board or somebody separate from our organization, what are those tasks that need to be done? I'll crack into this. Hopefully this is something I can demo, but adding users to teams, what permissionings do they need, what entitlements do they need, what data do they need access to? um, are we doing things like common tasks like sending out new user emails, or even emails that go out prior to employment or post employment? Entitlements management. So automate access request workflows. So let's say somebody that's already onboarded needs access to a particular document, but that has to go through an approval process. We can use entitle management to request, use workflows to request approval. We can create access packages, and we can review connected organizations and review our internal entitlement management as well. So who has access to what? Do they need it? Does it need to expire? And really take a close look at what we're giving people permissions to. Access reviews, that would be more on the privilege side. So review who has access to what, generate automate access reports, review which apps have permission to what. That's a big one that we talked about a little bit before. What our apps are accessing and what permissions they have. And then privileged identity management, which is something that's not very new, but just in time privilege access. So maybe not having standing access, but requiring privileged accounts to request that access when they need it, going through an approval process and only granting that privileged access for a limited amount of time. We also can review and monitor what privilege access is in our organization and our tenancy. And we can also automate workflows for privilege access requests and approvals. That was a lot. Sorry. These are definitely some eye charts here, but trying to break it down to that 10,000 foot level of what everything's included. So, like I said, if you have questions, shoot them at me. And then Entra workload identities. So I touched on this a little bit early. What are our applications, our service principals, and our managed identities? So this is centered around giving applications in our environment access to certain things within our organization's data that lives within the M365 services. Application, that's obvious. Applications often require access to information stored in your tenant. We want to make sure we're assigning, reviewing, and monitoring application access. We don't want those stale application entries for something that was maybe sunsetted and decommissioned a long time ago. We want to be able to go back and look and say, okay, we need to get rid of, this particular app registration we haven't used this app in a long time. It's just sitting out there doing nothing. The workload identities will help us identify those, as well as apps that may have more permissions than are necessary. What is a service principal? So the instance of the application in particular, service principals are essentially who can access the app and what the app has access to. And then managed identities are a service principal that allows developers to grant access without need for passing credentials. We talked about that as well. Like for example, we develop on a application here called Dice. Dice is an asset management program. Dice also has the ability to interface with Intune and your Intune deployment and get certain data from there and use that to leverage, say, pushing scripts to your assets. In order to do that, instead of just creating an account in everybody's tenant that's called Dice, that's a global administrator, we create a managed identity for Dice within Azure AD as an app registration. And we harvest the secret that Azure AD is given it, and we give that to the application, and then we control from within that managed identity exactly what that managed identity has access to and what it can change, and give it the appropriate permissions. And there we bypass the need for giving it a user credential that could be exploited. Granted, a managed identity could also be exploited, but it's a far more secure method than throwing out a username and password that could be exploited by a bad actor. So this is going to, I mean, if you haven't already experienced this, you should have at some point in time. Even Microsoft, as we're getting rid of that legacy authentication scheme and some of that's depreciating, this is a requirement even for some of their applications to interface with each other, or for scripting against, say, the Graph API. You're going to need these managed identities, and you're going to run into these scenarios. An Entra workload identity is something that's going to become your management tool for it. All right, so we got about 25 minutes left. Of course, I'm going way faster than I thought I would, but I'd like to go over a little bit on licensing, what it looks like for releases, all this stuff I'm talking about. Can you get your hands on it? What's it going to cost me? Is it free? If you want to manage anything, at the top here, I have the URL. Oops, dang it. At the top here, I have the URL entra.microsoft.com. If you have an Azure AD tenancy, you can log into that and see what's available to you. Azure Active Directory obviously is generally available. There are some features that we talked about that are still in preview, or additions to those services. Azure Active Directory almost always has at least a few preview features that are being added. I can think of a few alone that were just added around conditional access, sessions, and whatnot. But it's available as a standalone. You can go out and buy Azure Active Directory Premium 1 or Premium 2 for every one of your users. Azure AD P1, however, is included with your typical Enterprise 3, your A3 for education, or your G3 for government. So, and then we're talking about Azure AD P2, you'll typically see that bundled along with your E5, A5, G5 accounts. Our clients definitely have that. We have the majority of them are receiving Azure AD P1 and P2 through one of the EA or G suites. However, we do have quite a few that are buying those ad hoc and assigning those Azure AD premium licenses to each one of their users so they can leverage certain things within Azure AD. I could go on and on about Azure AD and the bundles, the other things you get with it, group-based licensing. There's a ton there. So any questions about that, let me know. You can always reach out offline as well. So Entra permissions management is generally available. I know there's a lot that's being developed on it. It's a standalone solution. It's about estimated is about $125 per resource per year. So resource, if I've read the licensing correctly, so don't hold my feet to the flame on this. We all know Microsoft licensing is is super fun to interpret, but I believe what they're referring to as a resource is if I want to use Entra permissions management to monitor AWS, for example, that would be $125. And then Google Cloud Platform would be an additional $125 per year. So there's a couple URLs here. You can get a 90-day free trial for permissions management. That's aka.ms/try permissions management. And if you want to look at the licensing and purchase it, it's aka.ms/buy permissions management. So Entra Verified ID right now is included with Azure AD subscriptions. I said even free tier there. I'm pretty sure that it's available on the free tier. From what I found, it didn't say that an Azure AD premium license was required for this. As the product develops, there may be some changes there, but you can get into Verified ID right now. You can configure it. It does require an Azure AD subscription or an Azure subscription as well. You do have to create an Azure Key Vault in order to use it. So you have to have an Azure subscription to tie that Key Vault to, and there may be some costs associated with using that Key Vault. You may already have Key Vaults that you could use, or you may already have a subscription or some general Azure spend that you could use on this as well. So if you're interested in this, as it becomes, getting ahead of it or playing with it, I would say definitely go into Entra Microsoft Management or entra.microsoft.com and look at Entra Verified ID, how to set it up, whatnot. There's some verification steps that we have to do here that we'll have a little bit of time to show you as well. Entra Identity Governance is generally available. There's also a free trial available. It's included with Azure AD P2. And then Entra Workload Identities is public preview, free trial coming. Pieces of it are available. However, it is still in preview, and I couldn't find what I needed as far as what the licensing requirements are going to be, but I'll hopefully follow that up. I might do a blog post within the next month as some of this is still kind of developing and being announced. All right, so let me figure this out here. I'm going to get into Entra here and make sure I can present. Let's stop sharing. Hopefully it's not just a giant, yep, it's just a giant thing of my head. Hi, everybody. Love that. All right, where is my screen? We want to share. Lifecycle workflows. All right, I think that is right. Okay, so this is the Entra admin center, essentially. Like I said up here, https://entra.microsoft.com. You can see it has your links to your Azure Active Directory. So from here, we can see what we'd also see in Endpoint Manager or portal.azure.com. Not all of it, but we see, our users, our groups, our devices, our applications, app registrations. We have some of the security features that we'd see in here: conditional access, identity protection, authentication methods, password reset. We can look at risky activities, identity governance. I've presented on these before. I don't want to dig too far into them because we are running out of time a little bit here. But there are some on our YouTube videos, especially for my last presentation, where I break down identity protection. We look at some of those demos and whatnot. So if you're interested in that, hit up our YouTube and smash like and subscribe. I think that's what the kids say nowadays. So if we want to take a look at identity governance, we took a look at entitlement management. Here's where we'd find our privilege access reviews. So if I wanted to kick off an access review, for example, I did this earlier this week and bugged the crap out of Kieran because I put him on there and it keeps prompting you. But I can kick off an access review for teams and groups or applications. So if I wanted to do this, so let's say I want to review the access on all the M365 groups with guests and users. I can exclude groups, or I can make a group, select a specific group to review access to. In this one, we're going to just let's just do all of them. And we can do all users or guest users as well. We can configure a review. I can pick who I want to be the reviewers. So it can be the owners of that group. I can select to it and I can have users review their own access, or the managers of the users. Managers of the users is going to be based on what's in Active Directory or Azure Active Directory for who they report to. I can set up a recurrence. So if I want this to happen annually, semi-annually, quarter, monthly, weekly, multi-stage review. So I can add up to 3 stages for the reviewers to complete the review. And I can say how long the review is open for. So every day that the review is open for, people are going to get prompted to do this as well. I'm going to just say group owners here, and I'm going to have it set up annually. and I can say whether I want it to end on specific dates, but we can say never. And then essentially I can auto apply the results. So if people approve the reviews at the end or approve the entitlements, it can just make those changes. I can click that off. So I can say, I want to approve based on what they say. I want to make the changes. And if or not the reviewers respond or not, we can have different. So we can say, if they don't revent, we want to just take the recommendations. If they don't respond, I want to approve the access or I want to remove the access. And once they've completed the review, the reviewer has completed the review, I can send a notification to whoever I want. And then there's decision helpers. So when somebody's reviewing, we can say, have them grant them the information of when their last. So if they have that user hasn't signed in within 30 days, we can let them know. And there's also some additional things here. And then we can require a justification, email notifications, and reminders. So some cool features there. You can play with this right now. It's out there. Privileged identity management, I don't want to go too far into. Like I said before, I've presented on this before, but if you have questions on how to spin this up, essentially it's just we grant access based on Azure AD roles. We grant particular people roles and their eligibility. So if they want to say become a global admin, they have to go into their roles and then sign in. I don't have anything set up in the dev tenant for this yet, but in our now micro tenant, when I want a global admin, I have to go into my roles, activate my role as a global admin. I'm the approver, so it doesn't go through an approval process, but let's say it needed to, I could send that off for approvals. Lifecycle workflows is super cool. Essentially, there's some templated workflows in here. If I want to create a workflow for a joiner, sorry, I have dogs upstairs losing their mind. Somebody must have walked past on the street menacingly. So they're just trying to protect us. So if you hear barking, I apologize. But new hire templates, essentially stuff that you would have for pre-hire tasks or new hire tasks, as well as employee termination or separation. So real time. So we might have something that it's their last day of work, but when it started the day, it wasn't their last day of the work, but towards the middle of the day, it's the last day here at work. So you may see have to have particular workflow for something like that, which may be revoking access, changing passwords, delicensing, all of that happy stuff. And then you can do pre-offboarding somebody that's given notice that they're going to be there. We may have a workflow that we kick off 2 weeks from there, where we start sending them the things they may need for their separation, and then we also have post offboarding of an employee. So there's some pretty cool templates here to get you started with all this. It's not like you're just off on your own. It's some pretty cool stuff here. But if we go in here, we have the ability to set a trigger. How many days from the event? So it's 7 days before the employee hire date. The employee hire date pulls from an Azure AD attribute. We create that we'd have to create the user before their hire date, but we'd say populate employee hire date and then calculate 7 days previously. So anybody 7 days before their hire date would have this workflow executed on them. We can also scope it down to, department equals or any of these others. So company names. So maybe you have more than one company. Employee IDs. Maybe everybody on the same, nobody has department, but everybody has employee ID and they differ from department to department. There's always, we typically are going to have, and we may actually have to create a custom. So we could go as far as using the extension attributes to dictate it. So if we have some type of IDM that's automatically creating the counts, we can plug it in by saying, okay, when a user in this department is onboarded, we need to make sure custom attribute number 3 says this, or we need to make sure their department is filled out correctly, all that good stuff. We're just going to go department equals marketing because and we can do expressions obviously as not, or we can add an expression. So, and department equals marketing and company equals now micro, right? And the task is here's where we go ahead and add tasks. So this is almost like you see in your general Power Automate where we can add users to the group, we can enable the user account, remove users from a group, um, a whole bunch of tasks that we can use, and there'll be more coming for this as well to make these tasks a little bit deeper and reach into more things. And then obviously your last screen would be to review what you want to do and then create the workflow. I'm not going to do that here because this is a dev tenant. We got 10 minutes left. I'm going to take a peek here at what Entra's permissions management looks like here real quick. So I've created a, it took a little bit to configure Entra permissions management. You have to have a subscription, obviously. And then you also have to have a resource group in order to enable it. If you click on Enter Permissions Management, it will ask you to either enable a trial or enable or purchase Enter Permissions Management. Right now, I believe the trial is 90 days. I have connected just a little bit ago our Azure AD. I don't know that since this is okay, so you can see it's pulling some of the information about Azure in here. I have not connected a Google Cloud Platform or AWS. I did give it permissions within our Azure AD account. It essentially gives you 2 or 3 PowerShell commandlets to run against the Azure AD. No, I'm sorry. It is the Azure AZ module that allow permissions for the permissions management to see your subscriptions and see your resource groups. In fact, I may be able to, essentially it's just 2 new AZ role assignments. You feed it the application ID and you give it reader rights to your subscription and you give it reader rights to your management group. But from there, it takes a while to compile. It will take a look at my permissions creep index. It's high since in the dev tenant, Tim D is just a full-on global admin, right? He has no privileged identity management. He has access to everything. Arguably, I need it, but you can imagine if this was your production tenant, we'd be taking a look at this account and be like, okay, there's something we should be doing here. Remediation, it does not have anything up here yet. I don't think my dev tenant is mature enough, but it would let me look for permissions. It will let me apply templates so I can create a template. Yeah, so I'm still playing with this as well. So I just wanted to at least let you guys see what it looks like and to have a little bit of a look at it. And I think the last thing real quick before I open it up to any questions here is verified ID. So verified ID, when I configured it, I essentially just had to give it my domain, so a website essentially. I had to give it name the organization. Here is Now Micro Dev, and then I had to configure a key vault. So all of the credentials and the attestments are stored in Azure Key Vault. In order to, so you can see right here, it's yelling at me because I have not registered my decentralized ID. If I were to do that, I would essentially, if I click register, it's going to give me a JSON file that I need to post on my website on kind of a sub page of my website that Azure can go out and verify that I own it. And then I also have to do the domain enter. I don't want to click on these because it's going to give people the JSON values that could exploit this if this goes up on YouTube. But same domain ownership verification is essentially we post, I believe it's a text record for the DID, but it might be posting another JSON file to the website as well. But then once you are have your domain and your DID registered, that allows you to that allows you to start using verified ID. Allows you to I can't get any further in here, but hopefully that at least gives you a little bit of an idea of what verified ID looks like and how to configure it. It's not going to let me do a whole lot in here until I actually register it, and to be honest, we're not going to be doing that with this anyway. But that being said, it is 2:25, so you've been listening to me yammer on for 55 minutes. Congratulations. You guys are awesome for doing that. I hope this had some value. Does anybody have any questions, comments, concerns, anything like that? Give you guys just a second here if anybody does have any. Otherwise, I thank you very much for attending. I hope this was insightful a little bit. There's still a lot to come on these services. There's still a lot for not only us, but Microsoft to figure out on some of these as well. But I'm excited. The identity space is growing. The need for it is growing, and we're all becoming very aware of the changes that need to happen in the near future to protect our identities, and possibly some of those status quos that we've seen in the identity space over the past 5 to 10 years, really getting turned around and maybe flipped on its head. So pay attention to the changes. I gave you some resources, but if you have any questions or you guys want to go over any of this, let me know. Once again, a quick plug: Admin Day, the MN365 user group on Friday. That's mn365.org /events. But I don't see any questions coming in, so I will say thank you very much, and we'll end there. All right, bye everybody.